All right, so we've been talking about some Supreme Court cases, and yesterday we started with the one that starts with Marbury versus Madison. And we talked about a couple of cases of national supremacy and a couple that had to do with civil rights and separate but equal. Today we're going to talk about the right to counsel, right to free speech, things that deal with the First Amendment, the Fourth, equality, more to do with civil rights, coupled with freedom of press and again with freedom of speech. So we are on the note sheet or the foldable, I should say, that starts with Tinker versus Des Moines. And Tinker versus Des Moines happened in the year 1969. Okay, the background of the case, what you need to write: students wear armbands to protest Vietnam War. So the students they wore a black armband to school that had a peace sign on it. This lady named Mary Beth Tinker and her brother and a couple of their friends wore black armbands to school. The school was not okay with that, suspended them and sent them home. The amendment that it involves is number 1. So amendment number 1, freedom of expression and freedom of speech. So the decision, freedom of speech is not limited in schools if not disruptive. Freedom of speech in school is not limited if not disruptive. Okay, so freedom of expression we'll define later. All right, next one up is my fave. It's Gideon versus Wainwright. Happens in 1963. Okay, so the background, the short version: man suspected of crime, arrested, denied a lawyer. So man is suspected of a crime, arrested, denied the right to an attorney. All right, so this is Amendment 6, because that's right to a speedy and fair trial, including a right to counsel. This little old man, Clarence Earl Gideon, has his little glasses on. He is homeless at this point. He hung out beside a bar and was suspected of robbing a bar. He did not actually rob the bar. He was arrested and could not afford an attorney, so he was denied an attorney and had to represent himself. He had a 3rd grade education. So at no point was he actually able to really defend himself in a court of law. He wrote to the Supreme Court. It's like a Cinderella story for the Supreme Court. He wrote down his petition to the Supreme Court on prison stationery. Had like whatever correctional facility at the top. He wrote to the Supreme Court in his little old man handwriting, and they have that letter that he wrote to the Supreme Court about having the right to an attorney framed in the Supreme Court House building. So the decision: you must be given an attorney even if you can't afford one. And again, this is Amendment 6. You must be given an attorney even if you can't afford one. So my man here eventually got out of prison and was acquitted of all charges because he did not actually rob the bar. All right. Next one up is Engel versus Vitale. This one happens in 1962. The background for this: students are forced to pray in school. And we know, because we're smart, we cannot do this based on the First Amendment. And the decision for this: students cannot be forced to pray in school. So forced prayer in school is unconstitutional. All right, so these words over here to the left, the Establishment Clause, means we cannot establish a what? Hope you already know, you should. The wall of separation, aka separation of church and state, means that religion and government need to be separate. They not need to be together. We are not a theocracy, a rule by religion. We are a democracy. All right, so again, this will be the First Amendment, freedom of religion. All right, next up is Mapp versus Ohio. This happens in 1961. All right, the background of this is lady is served fake warrant. Obscene materials are found. So lady is served fake warrant. Obscene materials are found. You spell the word obscene, in case of those of you who are wondering, Obscene. All right, so basically this lady was suspected of hiding a potential bomber in her home in Ohio, and the police served her a piece of paper that was folded up like a warrant, but it was actually a fake warrant, and they searched her house anyways, and they did not find the man. However, they did find all kinds of random porn in her basement, which is an obscene material which you cannot have in Ohio. So that was super fun. So this is Amendment 4, all right, and the decision, you cannot search homes without a warrant. All right, this lady was real ratchet, though, and she ended up getting arrested for a couple more things. She was real crazy. All right, so on the back where it says exclusionary rule, evidence gotten without a warrant can't be used in court. All right, so evidence gotten without a warrant can't be used in court. All right, next up we've got Regents of the University of California versus Back. We're just going to pronounce his name like that. Nobody's really sure how to pronounce it. It's just weird. Okay, this happens in 1978. 1978. The background of this case, white man is denied from med school twice because of race. So in college, we talked about this a little bit with affirmative action, but what that means is that in college, at this point in time in 1978, the University of California had a certain number of people of color and a certain number of minorities that they had to accept into med school or college of business or whatever part of the university this person was trying to be in. And the Supreme Court, the decision said that specific numbers of races is unconstitutional. So having a specific number of races is unconstitutional. So this guy was just peeved because he didn't get into med school. He was qualified for it, but he did not get into med school 2 separate times in favor of someone of color taking his place. And he was pissed that he did not get into med school because of his racial background. So this is called reverse discrimination, so discriminating against white people who typically have not been oppressed. All right, and the amendment for this would be number 14, about freedom of equality and equal protection. All right, next up is Swan versus the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. This extra V does not need to be there, cross it out. Okay, so Swan v. CharlotteMEC. Wow, we did not spell that correctly either, okay? So Charlotte is not spelled like this. That's Charlotte, which is not a thing. Okay, so Charlotte is C-H-A-R-L-O-T-T-E. So cross out this O and make this E into an O. That's just a hot mess. All right. This happens in 1971. So the background of this case is that students in Charlotte are bused to integrate schools. Bust, B-U-S-S-E-D, not bust like you're busting a move, okay? Students in Charlotte are bused to integrate schools. So what's happening in 1978, we know that Brown versus Board tells us that we have to integrate schools, 1971. But what this tells us is that Charlotte was taking kids, even though they might live like 2 minutes down the road from a school, they might be on the bus for an hour, hour and a half every day to take them to another part of the county. So instead of drawing weird district lines to make sure that each school was racially about the same and racially diverse, what they did instead was take kids and bus them across the county in order to integrate schools. So this parent was like, that's ridiculous. Busing is not a means to desegregate. So the Supreme Court ruled that it is constitutional to bus kids and integrate. It is constitutional to use busing to integrate. All right, and this is the 14th Amendment of Equality and Equal Protection. All right, so it is constitutional to use busing. So if we were to group this together with something, we would group together Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board, and Swan v. CharlotteMEC. All 4 of those would go together as civil rights. Okay, next up, our last 2 for today. This one is the New York Times versus the United States. This happens in 1971. Yes, the state is correct. All right, it happens in 1971. So what happens, the New York Times publishes papers about the Vietnam War. So the background, the New York Times publishes papers about the Vietnam War. So what happens is they take some papers that were supposed to have been classified. They had a leak in what's called the Pentagon, which is where the leaders of all 5 military branches are. Get it? Pentagon, 5 sides, 5 branches. So they published some papers about the Vietnam War that were not supposed to have been out for the public eye. All right, and they did not use what's called prior restraint. Okay, so this is using judgment to publish or not. Okay, using judgment to publish or not. All right, since these papers had all actual sensitive information taken out of them or blocked out, colored over, which is called redacting, they were okay to publish. Still, the United States government or the United States military, I'm pretty sure it was the Army, decided to ask the New York Times to take it out of the newspaper and tried to issue a court order to get the papers back from them. And so the New York Times, in turn, sued the United States. So this amendment that it's about is Amendment Number 1, Freedom of the Press. Okay, and the decision, newspapers do have the right to publish if prior restraint is shown. So newspapers do have a right to publish if prior restraint is shown. Basically what they're saying is that if you have looked through and any information that is actually sensitive enough to get somebody killed has been colored over or taken out, you are allowed to publish what you want to publish. Okay? All right, we should know what censorship is at this point. All right, the last one for today is Schenck versus the United States. Schenck versus U.S. This happens in 1919. I hope you know what's happening in the world during 1919 because there's a question coming up on it. All right, so the background for this is this man, Schenck. You pronounce this like the word sink, like the kitchen sink, but with an S, so Schenck. All right, not shank, like you shank somebody. That's rude. All right, so the background for this is that this man passes out papers suggesting that people dodge the draft. This man passes out papers urging people to dodge the draft. Okay, so basically it said, like, do not be intimidated, blah, blah, blah. All right, and he is telling people not to sign up for the draft for World War I. And we know, because we're smart and we actually paid attention in world history, that there was an active draft in World War I, and we only entered into World War I in the last 2 years of the war. Okay, it had been going on for a while, but we did not enter into it until 1917. All right, so this man is like, no, you do not need to do this. You do not need to be in the draft. So he gets arrested for violating what's called the Espionage Act, or pretty much the Spy Act. Okay, so they say that he's causing clear and present danger to the United States and threatening the United States military. So the decision in Schenck versus U.S., freedom of speech is limited in time of war. Freedom of speech is limited in time of war. Right, and again, this is the First Amendment. All right, so this has been the Tinker Sheet.